Remaking Middle School is launching a middle school listening tour. We want to know what comes to mind when you hear middle school. What do you think is and isn't working for middle school students today? What is the future of middle level education? If you are any of the following, a parent, a teacher, administrator, youth development professional, policymaker, or youth advocate of middle grade students, we would love to hear from you. There are two ways in which you can lend your voice to this project. You can complete an online survey. The survey will take about 10 minutes to complete. Or you can chat with a member of the Remaking Middle School team. Interviews take about 30 to 45 minutes of your time and can be done by phone or Zoom. If you're interested in sharing your perspective on middle school education, please visit remakingmiddleschool.org and click Sign Up for the listening tour. Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Thanks for listening to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School Initiative, whose founding partners include Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia's Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and the Association for Middle Level Education, or AMLE. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, I talk with Clark McKown, president and founder of xSEL Labs, and associate professor of behavioral sciences at Rush University Medical Center. xSEL Labs conducts an array of research in the education and youth field specific to social and emotional learning, or SEL. Notably, xSEL Labs also develops assessments for student social and emotional competencies, as well as school climate and SEL for adults. xSEL Labs is currently building a new set of SEL assessments for middle school age students, which are being designed not only with middle school students in mind, but with their direct input.
With our middle school assessment, we took it up a notch and we said, look, rather than adults in a room dreaming up assessment items and vignettes and stuff, we need to enlist two kinds of input as we build the assessment. One is experts and in adolescent development and assessment, and the other is the best experts, middle school students. We convened a series of focus groups with middle school students and said, hey, here are the things that we want to measure. Can you tell us how relevant these things are to your life and what it looks like for a middle school student, to basically, what does peer pressure look like in middle school? How do you deal with peer pressure? What are the kinds of things that come up? We drafted some items and presented them to them and said, what do you think of these? And some of them would be like, oh yeah, that's on the mark. And some of them, they were like, that never happens. I know what you're getting at, and I can answer the questions, but that's just not a situation that ever happens. We're like, okay, thanks for letting us know. And so we're trying to enlist diverse groups of youth to help us build the assessments.
In part one of our conversation, Clark and I talk about the history of xSEL Labs, the key differences of social and emotional learning for adolescents versus for younger children, and the evidence-based methods xSEL Labs uses to develop SEL measures, as well as when and where and how in school environments the measures are administered. In part two, we address important ways to factor racial and cultural inputs into SEL measures, Clark's views on the current state of the SEL field and where it's going, as well as emerging ways xSEL Labs is looking to provide more supports to educators to implement SEL programming most effectively. That's in just a little bit. Now, here's part one of my interview with Clark McKown. Clark, it's a delight to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into social emotional learning and measures of SEL competencies and middle grade students and supporting educators, all the great stuff that you do, let's get a bit of background on you if we can. It looks like you hail from Northern California. You earned degrees in psychology from Yale and UC Berkeley, some postdoc work at Stanford University Medical Center. You've been associated with Rush University Medical Center in Chicago since 2005 and now run xSEL Labs. It seems like you've kind of gone the academic route, research and teaching, but also have a strong impulse to be a leader and to build things that can be used more broadly in the education and youth field. Tell me if that's a fair characterization and why these different facets of this work interest you.
Yeah, I think that is a fair characterization. I did come up through the academic research world. I'm actually a child clinical psychologist by training. One of the things I always loved in my clinical work, and even before I went to grad school, was talking with kids and figuring out how they think about stuff. Because children, especially really young children, do not actually look at the world or understand the world the same way that you and I do. And so it's just such an interesting and challenging exercise, really, to understand how kids see things, how to like connect with them in a way that nurtures their growth. And did SEL instruction in the New Haven schools in the 1980s. So that's been the thread, is like figuring out how to connect with kids positively and understand their points of view and what we can do to nurture their positive development. And I mean, I think that the crossover to the business world has been a really, really interesting one. And I've learned a ton. For a while, my sort of prime directive was do the best academic work I could do. And then somewhere along the line that shifted to find ways to have the most impact with what you do that you can. And part of that's academic, but part of that is squarely outside of the arena of academia. So that's led me to be a little iconoclastic in my career choices.
Well, that's great. We definitely are big believers in research practice connections on this podcast and in the work that we do. So xSEL Labs, this is an organization you founded 5 or so years ago. Is it an offshoot of the Rush Neurobehavioral Center, or was it an entity you spun out of Rush? Just tell us a little bit about the genesis of the organization and its mission.
Yeah, so it started about 5 years ago. It is, I guess you could call it a university spinoff. It's totally independent of the university at this point, although the university owns a little piece of the company. I started it because, we'd been doing all this work to develop and field test and validate methods of assessing children's social and emotional competence. And they worked great, and educators wanted them. And then the grants were going to end. And so the question was what to do next. And one option was, well, we can take these things that we know work really well that people want, and we can just, pat ourselves on the back for a job well done. We created something cool. Let's put it on the shelf, let it gather dust, move on to the next grant. That just did not feel right to me. And I felt like I want to see what we can do. Is there an appetite for this in not just the marketplace of ideas, but the K-12 marketplace? Is there a way to expand the impact of this work by commercializing it? And so we started xSEL Labs and then worked with the university to license the intellectual property to the company. So it's been a very collaborative effort to spin it off. I originally tried to establish a couple of school contracts through the university and run the quote unquote business out of Rush. But it was hard. Rush is awesome. It's a great place, and they do what they do really, really well, which is provide healthcare services. But they're not like a K-12 education company. So, we put a contract in front of their lawyers and they go, what? What are you doing? And so it just became clear that there needed to be another entity that was really built for trying to get the assessments into the hands of educators. And that was how xSEL Lab started.
The work that you do in SEL covers a number of aspects, as I understand it, including SEL competencies, but also things like school climate. Why those component pieces, and how would you describe that portfolio? How those what's the thread that connects those together?
The sort of expansion of our assessment offerings has come from two places. And for lack of a better description, I'm going to say there's sort of like a top-down origin and a bottom-up origin. We started, as I mentioned, building these really student competence assessments. And our mission essentially was to build a better mousetrap. You had self-report surveys and you had teacher rating scales, which are helpful, but we just wanted to more directly ascertain the competencies that kids are bringing to their interactions. We did a great job of that. And then we started on this commercialization venture. And as we talked to here's the bottom-up part, we are talking to our education partners and listening to them. I mean, I think the most interesting intellectual exercise I've had, and this includes, time at Yale and UC Berkeley, has been listening to educators and really fully trying to understand what they're up against and using that to think about how can we do what we do better. And one of the things that was clear was that, yes, they needed to understand their student competencies to figure out what to teach to whom and to see that they're making the kind of progress they intend to. but that there are other things at play, like the conditions of learning that either nurture or don't nurture students' academic, social, and emotional competencies. Everybody is concerned about adult well-being and social emotional learning. So how do we figure out how to provide assessments that can help support those efforts? Another piece that we haven't fully conquered yet. So let's go to the top-down part. Top-down is I've felt for a while like, okay, why do assessment in SEL? Why bother? Because nobody really except for weird people like me, nobody likes testing kids, it takes time, it's annoying, all that. Well, we exist, and our aspiration is that our assessments can support consistent, high-quality SEL practices in schools. That's it, period. If the assessment's not doing that, don't assess kids. If you can use the assessment data to do that, it's an investment of time and effort that's worthwhile. So what do you need to have data support practice? Well, yeah, you need to know where your kids are starting, to know what to teach to whom at what point to see their progress. But you need to understand the climate that's nurturing or not nurturing. You need to understand implementation. Is the SEL program that you purchased being used? And is it being used well? Are students engaged? So we've tried to develop implementation surveys to get at how much are teachers using their resources and how is it going and how are your adults doing? Because if adults aren't doing well, they're not going to be in a position to teach. So the kind of broader vision is a flexible suite of assessments that can be used to meet the information needs of educators so that they can do the very best work possible to support kids' social and emotional development.
Let's dive into SEL for middle grades specifically. You and I both have experience with Roger Weisberg. For those who don't know, who listening in, Roger was the founder and longtime leader at CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and really one of the giant gurus of the SEL field who passed away last year. You'll correct me on this because I think we're maybe collaborating on this work, but Roger did a lot of his early work on SEL in New Haven, Connecticut with middle school age youth. The field as a whole, though, I think it's safe to say, in terms of programming at least, and maybe research as well, really concentrated mostly on younger children in the early childhood years, preschool and into elementary school. And for a long time, there just wasn't as much focus on middle and certainly high school aged youth. That's certainly changed. I mean, today there's much more interest and focus in SEL for older youth. What do you see as some of the unique features of SEL for adolescents versus younger children? And how does that influence the research and measurement work you were doing around SEL for kids of this age?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. I feel like the emphasis has been on the early grades more than middle school and high school. I think there are a number of reasons for that. My impression is that early childhood educators and elementary educators see their job responsibilities as including nurturing children's social and emotional and character development. That's not like an extra thing. That's part of the core of what they do, And so it's an easier fit to say, okay, let's name the things that you're trying to do implicitly, and let's equip you with tools so that you can do those things intentionally rather than by accident. And so that made sense to me that evolved that way. Then the other piece is that David Yeager from UT Austin writes about this, that, when you look at the research on the effectiveness of SEL programs, the magnitude of the benefit of SEL programs on child outcomes is really big in elementary school. It's sizable. It's pretty small in middle school, like hardly noticeable. And by the time you get to high school, the overall effect size is exactly 0. Now, that's for explicit SEL instruction, and things may have changed a little bit, but why would that be? I mean, David Yeager argues that, whereas little guys are pretty open to being taught social and emotional skills. They want to figure this stuff out, how to participate in classroom life, how to get along with others. So a teacher can go in and do some lessons about that and have conversations about it, all good. But you try to teach an adolescent social skills and how to get along with others and all that stuff, it quickly becomes, for lack of a better word, really cheesy, and adolescents can feel condescended to, and it's a real turnoff. So it's not that SEL becomes less important as you get older. It's just that I think the delivery mechanism for nurturing those competencies within middle school and high school needs to change to meet the developmental realities of adolescence.
So is that where environment comes into play? I'm recalling I had a conversation last year on this podcast with Kent Pickell, who at the time was running Search Institute and is now a superintendent in Minnesota. And he was talking about, Search has done a lot around developmental relationships. That's their big deal. And he was talking about the difference between relationship development activities, which are the kind of the active, like you're actually engaged in activities that are designed to develop positive relationships with young people. And then he said something about developmental relationship building approaches, which is more that kind of the context environment and how you set up environments so that positive relationships can happen. Is that more of what needs to happen? And this maybe is why you went into things like school climate and culture, because it's really kind of that environmental piece where they're navigating that environment and how that maybe more implicitly rather than explicitly develops social emotional competencies?
I think so. I think that's a really important part of it is a focus on relationships. Middle schools are a funny thing, and I know that you and your colleagues at UVA are working on this, but just at the time when young people need strong supportive relationships with adults and peers, you go from elementary schools, which are largely designed to support a strong relationship between adults and kids and peers and each other, to this weirdly departmentalized and impersonal structure that's focused on academic instruction. Now, that's a little cookie cutter. I know it's not that way every place, but it largely is that way. And so middle schools are kind of not designed for middle schoolers, for middle schoolers' adolescent needs. So I think, a focus on relationships and environment is really important. I also think, the other thing about adolescence, of course, is that no children are just empty vessels. There's agency, and especially in adolescence, the desire to start flexing your independence and having a say over how things go in your education and your life is really important, to the extent that adolescents can be enlisted in creating contexts for their own development. It's not that they should be able to have a blank slate, but to the extent they can be enlisted, you're more likely to get them to be really engaged. We're working in a high school district in the suburbs of Chicago where there's a psychology committee, there's a social emotional learning committee, there's a data science committee, and all of these committees are leading school efforts to create a more positive environment for students. They're doing stuff that no adult could do because they're the ones who are part of the adolescent community. And I think there's something to be learned from that. Yes, relationships, yes, environment, and yes, enlisting the adolescent desire to shape their environments in positive ways. I think all that is part of the mix, and I don't know the total answer of how we do this really well.
Let's talk about the measures you're building. You alluded to this, I believe. For a lot of people, even educators, xSEL for a long time has seemed much harder to measure than academic outcomes. Just tell us a little bit about the process of developing effective measures for xSEL.
When we first started with this, it was when I was a clinician, and I actually don't see patients anymore, but I still have a little bit of that orientation. But a lot of kids would come to the center that I used to run, and their parents would be concerned about them because they were having a tough time learning, they're having a tough time focusing, making friends, or just participating constructively in community life. And regardless of their diagnosis, almost all of them had trouble with peers, like making friends, keeping friends, earning the acceptance of their peers. And so there you had these teacher rating scales. You could interview kids, you could give them some assessments that kind of sort of got at social stuff, but it was like whereas if a kid couldn't read, you could give them a battery of really well-validated reading instruments and figure out this is what's going on and this is what would help. There's nothing like that socially. So we thought, well, how can we more directly get at the social skills kids need to connect? And so there have been all these assessments developed for research purposes, like assessments to measure how well kids understand others' emotions. It's part of CASEL social awareness. You show kids pictures of faces and they label the emotion. There are assessments of how well kids understand others' perspectives. You tell kids stories and ask them about story characters, and their responses tell you how much they're able to take the point of view of somebody else. There are assessments that were developed to measure social information processing or social problem solving with hypothetical challenging social situations, all for research purposes. And so what we did is we're like, okay, let's try these out in our clinic and see if they seem to be getting us something useful. And long story short, we did, and it was very messy data, but we got some really good early evidence that this is a helpful strategy for understanding things that kids need to be successful. And if they're not in place, they're going to have a harder time. And so we started then building assessments using the same kind of strategy, direct assessment, not surveys, directly assessing the skills. So the kids have to show what they know. They got to demonstrate their competencies by solving challenging tasks. We felt that that gives you something different than a survey where kids are rating their perceptions of their skills, or where teachers are rating perceptions of the skills. It takes away that like perception part where there could be inaccuracy, lack of self-awareness, unwillingness to admit a challenge, or just lack of candor overall. All that stuff is mixed in with the rating of the measurement of competence with self-report and teacher report. We thought if we could get an assessment that's unmediated by perceptions, we might be able to get a little bit closer to measuring the skills themselves. The skills that are targets of instruction in SEL programs, the skills that are part of SEL standards in states that have them. In so doing, give educators data that, is more like a formative assessment of reading or math skills that they can use to guide instruction. I think it's a step removed to use survey data for those purposes, but we think that with direct assessment, it's possible to use the assessment data really to be targeted in instruction.
And where does this happen? Does this happen in classrooms? Does it happen in like advisory at the middle school level? Where does this actually take place?
We're building the middle school assessment as we speak, so that's a little bit of TBD. But for the elementary grades, kids interact with a series of tasks on a web application. So they just have to log into a portal, and then they wear headphones because the elementary assessment is narrated and illustrated, and they just interact independently with a series of tasks. It takes about 30 minutes to complete, and boom, they're done. And usually that's done in class. Sometimes teachers rotate kids through stations. Sometimes they do whole class administration if they're a one-to-one technology school district. Sometimes people take kids to like media labs or libraries and do the assessment in batches. But it's not an unfamiliar thing now that a lot of achievement tests are done on computers in this way. And with middle school, we have now a small handful of middle school partners who've delivered the first version of our middle school assessment. And again, it's been done in a variety of ways. But at least one, pretty large middle school had several hundred students over the course of 2 days and about 6 hours. They just administered all 700 kids. I think what they did is they said, social studies, that's the time you're going to do this. So every time kids had social studies, they just opened up their laptops and logged in.
That was part one of my interview with Clark McKown, president and founder of xSEL Labs. In part two, we will talk about the ways xSEL Labs incorporates factors of race and cultural background in the design of SEL assessments, where the SEL field is today and where it's going, and what's next for xSEL Labs in supporting educators to use SEL programming effectively. That's in just a moment on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I spoke with Daquan Oliver, founder and CEO of We Thrive. Still in his first decade of his career, Daquan has earned prestigious professional fellowships in the social sector with Ashoka and Echoing Green, and was featured as one of Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 social entrepreneurs. We Thrive is the social enterprise Daquan founded in 2014. We Thrive offers middle and high school youth programming and seed money to develop real revenue-generating businesses, bolstered by an array of skill-building curriculum and experiences around financial literacy, problem-solving, and leadership, as well as opportunities to develop social capital through a network of mentors and advisors. We Thrive seeks to make entrepreneurship education and the opportunities it can bring equitably accessible, and in doing so, really reframes how we even talk about and view youth, not as under-resourced, but rather underestimated.
As a young person, who would you rather be? Would you rather be the person in the program that's at risk, that's disadvantaged, or underestimated? The other second thing that I'll say, it also better connotates who the real problem is, right? At risk and under-resourced and disadvantaged, all those things do is say like, oh, it's their problem. They're not resourced enough. And actually, the real thing is the audience member is the issue. And so back to underestimated, it also calls the question, oh, well, who's estimating them in the first place? Oh, it's me. And so it also draws that question out as well. And then to put a proper high valuation of this young person or whoever it is. We happen to target youth, but of course they're not the only individuals underestimated.
You can catch all of my conversation with Daquan in a previous episode. And now, returning for part 2 of my conversation with Clark McKown. In one of the early episodes of this podcast, I interviewed Rob Jagers, who is the VP of Research at xSEL, and he has spent a lot of his work to influence greater understanding of the racial and cultural dimensions of SEL and how SEL is used in learning settings. From a measurement perspective, how have you thought about or incorporated racial and cultural factors into the methods and tools you develop and use?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I can't pretend that we've got it all worked out and we're evolving as we go. But I'll tell you some things we've done, some things we're doing now, and some things we envision doing in the future. Our elementary assessments there are a lot of illustrations and depictions of kids as part of vignette-based item development, and we intentionally depicted kids from demographically diverse backgrounds because we wanted kids to be able to see themselves in the assessment content. That's probably the most superficial way to integrate culture and race into an assessment. The other thing we've done, though, is we built the assessment both in English and in Spanish because the predominant second language in elementary schools around the country is Spanish. But we built it in Spanish and English, and we've done a lot of careful psychometric work to make sure that the assessment works equally well in English and in Spanish for kids from different racial ethnic groups and for boys and girls. From a psychometric point of view, what you want to make sure is that the scores you get from kids from different groups have the same meaning about the skills that are being measured. Otherwise, it's a biased assessment. And we've published a few articles on both differential item functioning and measurement equivalence of our assessments. And I feel confident that it measures equally well across groups. Now, that's not the whole picture, though. With our middle school assessment, we took it up a notch and we said, look, rather than adults in a room dreaming up assessment items and vignettes and stuff, we need to enlist 2 kinds of input as we build the assessment. One is experts and in adolescent development and assessment, and the other is the best experts, middle school students. We convened a series of focus groups with middle school students and said, hey, here are the things that we want to measure. Can you tell us how relevant these things are to your life and what it looks like for a middle school student, to basically, what does peer pressure look like in middle school? How do you deal with peer pressure? What are the kinds of things that come up? We drafted some items and presented them to them and said, what do you think of these? And some of them would be like, oh yeah, that's on the mark. And some of them, they were like, that never happens. I know what you're getting at, and I can answer the questions, but that's just not a situation that ever happens. We're like, okay, thanks for letting us know. And so we're trying to enlist diverse groups of youth to help us build the assessments. So that's where we come to where I think we need to go as a field. And I don't know the answer to this question is, what is the full range of competencies that should be assessed and addressed so that kids from whatever background are getting the benefit of the best of our thinking? I think Rob and the xSEL group have done a really nice job of expanding the definition of xSEL competencies to include, not to get rid of the old definition, but to build upon it by explicitly acknowledging equity and diversity in the nature of the competencies themselves. Should we and how can we assess things like bias? And should we and can we address things like bias? I think these are all open questions. There's a lot of cultural pushback going on right now in both directions around SEL. I think a vigorous debate is needed to figure this out, but hopefully without vitriol, so we can really come to something that's basically good for kids and builds on the good stuff we already have.
Beyond our talk of measurement and SEL competencies and so forth, just some of your reflections on where SEL as a field sits today. It really, in my mind, it's really become ascendant in the education world over the past, say, 5 to 7 years. I mean, I remember being at xSEL several years ago and us trying to, bang at the doors, to let us in. And now all of a sudden everybody wants to talk about SEL. When you use your microscope, what is your assessment of where SEL is today? And then when you get out your crystal ball, what does the future hold for the space?
I mean, I think that anything that gets big enough will end up drawing fire from critics. And, I think that that's natural. And to a degree, it's good. We don't want to be just blindly growing without addressing what are potentially real drawbacks to what we're doing. I think the vitriol is not helpful, though, because in the final assessment, the social emotional competencies and climates that we're trying to create, when you describe what they actually are, pretty much everybody would agree these are things we want kids to figure out how to do. And these are what employers want adults to be able to do when they're interviewing for jobs. These are what we need people to be able to do to be functioning and contributing members of society. So it's not some foreign, indoctrination thing. It's simply equipping kids with the skills they need to be successful. And when people know that, I think they're much less likely to be opposed to it. When I look into the crystal ball, I do think that there are a few challenges the field is up against that are adjacent to and feed into the culture wars, but are somewhat distinct from it. As it's gone big, more than 50% of schools had adopted some form of SEL initiative or program. I'm confident that substantially fewer than 50% of schools are doing SEL in a high quality way. Not to cast aspersions on those schools, but there is an important gap between purchasing a curriculum and using it, and then a second gap between using a curriculum and using it well. And I can't tell you how many educators I talk to or educational leaders I say, well, what program are you using? They say, well, we're using X program, whatever it is, evidence-based. When it's done well, we know it'll produce outcomes. And I say, well, how's it going? I don't know how it's going. I don't know if anybody actually uses it. So there's a question of how do we maintain quality at scale so that what we knew worked in the context of randomized controlled trials continues to have a benefit for students even as it's gone big. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of the field right now. And we don't have data. We have the meta-analyses that show when you do it well, it works. But then without data to go along with practice, without knowing whether you're moving the needle, there's a high risk that people will go, look, we spent all this money and time and effort on SEL and it didn't do anything. Well, it didn't do anything because you didn't actually do it. Part of our reason for existing, having data to support practice, is we want the evidence to move beyond the field trials to be part of the practice so that we can know what's working, we can know what's not working, and we can make mid-course corrections to make sure that SEL maintains its potency and potential. Without that, I have some concerns that it will be vulnerable to fads, to the sort of fate of fads, and it will be vulnerable to political criticisms that might be quieted were there data to support the ongoing effectiveness of SEL initiatives in schools.
Yeah, there is a bit of notion out there. My wife is a sixth grade English language arts teacher, and SEL is like a 30-minute a week lesson. And I think people like her and other teachers, when it's done really effectively, you're doing SEL all the time. But there's always been sort of a bit of a debate, I think, within the SEL community. I remember having conversations with Roger about this, where there are people like him, I think, who would say the explicit instruction is critical. That's really what needs to happen. And others are pushing that, well, actually, it needs to happen all the time. It's kind of like the activities versus the approach on the relationship side. So in some ways, I feel like the SEL world itself is having kind of this debate about what is the right approach within schools. But I think what you offer is really interesting, because I think what you're layering in is that the intervention is not just the approach and it's not just the actual explicit instruction. Data itself is an intervention tool. The data itself enables teachers, educators in lots of contexts to constantly calibrate and adjust on based on what they're seeing right in front of them. And that could be, I assume you would argue, is at least as valuable, if not maybe sometimes more valuable than the sequence program that you're trying to follow.
Absolutely. I mean, that's our goal, is to have data kind of live in that way, not just be inert or abstract or out there, but, stir emotions and stir action. It's not so easy to make that happen. Doesn't always happen, but I feel like it has the potential to do that. And, as to the debate you're talking about that I hear all the time too, between Freestanding SEL programs and integration with academics, I am a cake and eat it too kind of guy. And I actually think both is the answer. I really agree with Roger's perspective that if you don't set aside some time for the explicit instruction, it's really not likely to happen in a meaningful way. Everybody says, well, how am I going to find time? Well, most people find when they do it and do it well, you buy back more than the amount of time you spent on SEL with engagement of your students, but it takes a little while to be convinced of that. But I don't think 15 minutes a day is enough either. And so this is another challenge of the field is how in a systematic way to equip our educators with the tools they need to be able to reinforce social and emotional competencies throughout the day as they're doing social studies, as they're doing reading, as they're doing math, as they're doing other stuff. I mean, that happens. Teachers see their relationships with their kids rightfully as a context for supporting that. So it's not like it's brand new, but I do think there are probably some very easily deployed strategies that teachers could use to amplify the benefits of explicit instruction so that it's a both and, not an either or.
Clark, what's next for your work? Any new frontiers you want to explore or wade into, or new tools you're developing or want to develop?
I mean, we're still working on this middle school assessment. That's part of my Rush University work, but I'm excited about it. We've already got version 2.0 out in the field. We've learned a ton from our fall field trials. We're looking for middle school students to participate in some data collection. So if anybody out there is listening and they have some middle schoolers who want to be part of the research project and spend some time with an RA talking about SEL, we'd love to hear from you. We have a self-report survey for high school, which actually is kind of interesting, but I'd love to develop a direct assessment for the high school grades too. That would be, if not a holy grail, at least a holy thimble. I think the other thing we see it's not all that sexy, I suppose, but educators they're bombarded with systems and things to log into and information and all this stuff. So we're starting to see that the way that we can actually have the maximum impact with data is by having our systems play nicely with others. So to what extent can we plug our assessment into student information systems, data visualization systems, other program providers' systems, so that there's one unified experience rather than a bunch of siloed experiences? To me, that will be where I think we're going to realize our full potential, but that's still very much in the aspirational phases.
My wife is teaching right now, but I can hear her cheering when you say something like that, because the array of things that they have to manage in terms of the different platforms that are associated with certain curriculum or certain aspects of their work, it is a lot, and sometimes it's just not beneficial. And certainly I think from an opportunity standpoint, there's a lot more that could be done in more effective ways if we can get to the place where you're talking about. Finally, Clark, if there was one bit of advice based on your experience in social emotional learning and measuring SEL competencies that you would offer to educators both in school and in after school and in summer programs of things they either ought to know or ought to be doing, what would it be?
One thing did leap to mind, and it is to keep it simple when you're starting. The whole thing can seem overwhelming. Just the CASEL competencies. There are 5 competencies and there are 8 gajillion sub-competencies. How do I even begin to think about teaching that stuff? Well, just start with something. I mean, we're working in a school district that's using a wonderful curriculum, and we did a breakout sessions in the PLC we're running, and we said, what do you want to get out of the PLC? They said, we just want to get started with the program. We just need a little help getting started. And it's not like they needed a 5-day training series to figure out how to do every piece of that program well. They simply needed a start point. And once they got started, the rest of it they can kind of figure out on their own, or with a little bit of support, do a great job with. Keep it simple. Same with data. Like, data can be overwhelming. We've tried to make our assessment reports really digestible and straightforward, but you've got 5 things you're looking at. You've measured them. You've got these performance plots. That's a lot of things. Pick one and focus on it and see if you can move the needle on that one thing. It's maybe simplistic, but I just think you've got to start somewhere and then layer on complexity as mastery comes. I actually think that if we can do that as a field, it'll lower the barriers and increase the extent to which people are doing SEL and doing it well.
I think that's really good advice. Well, Clark, I'm so glad that we had an opportunity to do this and to hear from you. I appreciate the value you're bringing, not only to the SEL world, but of course to the learning and development of young adolescents in the middle school years. So thanks for joining me, and all the best to you in your work.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. I enjoyed the conversation.
That was Clark McKown, founder and president of xSEL Labs. You can follow xSEL Labs online at xSEL-labs.com, on Facebook at xSEL Labs, and on Twitter at xSEL_labs. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org, or learn more about the founding partner organizations, the University of Virginia's Youth-Nex Center, on the web at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, or on Twitter at youth_nex, and the Association for Middle Level Education, on the web at amle.org or on Twitter at AMLE. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Kim Slack. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website, on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.